This is now the third wave of the crisis, arguably probably the deadliest wave of the crisis that we've seen right now.
I'm a huge fan in harm reduction. We got to keep you alive. There's designated drivers. There's designated somebody who carries Narcan, who carries things, and that's just the way it is. Welcome back to the Seano Show. I'm your host, Seano McFarland. Today's guest is a true warrior in the fight for addiction recovery and reform. He's an author, advocate, and one of the most outspoken voices on the opioid crisis, particularly when it comes to the devastating impact of fentanyl. His work isn't just about telling his own story, it's about changing the ways we approach addiction, recovery, and ensuring people have access to the help they need. Welcome, Ryan Hampton, to the show.
It's a great day to be alive, isn't it?
It's this great day to be alive. It's a great day to be sober. And what an incredible blessing to have you on the show. Thank you for making availability. I know you're a busy man.
I'm grateful to do it and grateful you're having me on.
Before we get started, brother, I want to acknowledge that September's Recovery Month, and that's something that's near and dear to your heart. Will you tell me more about Recovery Month and why it's so important?
You know, Recovery Month, it's a time for us to celebrate, right? The 23 million Americans who live in long-term recovery, and I think that number is underreported. It's a moment for us to stop and reflect at, the strides that we've made in the recovery movement. We've come a long way, even when I got up on 10 years sober, right? February 2nd, 2015. And I can just remember it was different. It was different even 10 years ago. People,
yeah, big time.
People wear their recovery loud and proud and talk about it and post about it and do podcasts about it and write books about it and create nonprofits to help other people. And, we have strong, resilient communities because of recovery. And, there's one piece of it where it's celebratory, I think, for us in a moment of reflection for us, but it's equally as important for communities to see the value of recovery that's happening every single day, the value that's happening in their businesses and their employees and, within government and within our social systems. And to see that when we invest into recovery, when we invest, into folks' being and their health, that we actually make our communities stronger, we make them safer, we make them more resilient, we improve our economy. There's all sorts of things to celebrate, but it's a moment to step out of the shadows, right? But it's
right on.
It's so important, though, to realize that not every single person has the privilege, and it is a privilege like you and I do, right? To be able to openly talk about this on a very large podcast platform or to write a book about it. There's still a lot of people, today who do suffer in silence. Or who are suffering in silence because they're still struggling, or who have to be silent about their recovery because there's still discrimination and bias and prejudice that exists against folks. They could, be passed up on a job promotion. They could, if there's justice involved, there could be issues with their kids or with their own livelihood. There's issues around, health insurance and life insurance. So I think it makes it equally important for us, to be loud for those who can't until they can.
Beautiful, beautiful, because I love your energy. I love your mission statement. We, of course, know about the problem, but you are big in solution. You're big about living out loud. You're big about we don't do shame here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we don't do shame here. And I think, a lot of folks, look, early in my recovery, I didn't plan. None of this was planned. I think we're all accidental accidents, right? Like none of this was in the plan.
Amen.
For me. And when I did get sober, right, on February 3rd, the day that the first wake up I had after the day I got sober, February 3rd, 2015, I didn't wake up and say, I want to write a book. I want to start Mobilize Recovery. I want to work with iHeart. I want to, write 3 books, actually. I want to, talk about this in the media. I want to help write policy. I want to get, these projects up and running. That was anything further from imagination. The goal really was just to get my life back together and live a normal life as much as I could. And I wanted to put this addiction thing and recovery thing in a lockbox, and put it away and never really talk about it. My family also didn't want to talk about it. But there came a time, there was a moment of change for me in 2016. And I was still, in a sober home. And I had lost a couple friends really close to me, and they were being, turned away at emergency rooms when they were asking for help. They weren't able to get into treatment because their insurance wouldn't pay for it. They couldn't get in treatment because Medicaid wouldn't pay for it. They were dying of overdoses in recovery homes because the homes declined to carry Narcan or teach residents on how to use it because they thought it was a crutch. And all that felt very weird to me, I guess, to for lack of a better term, and strange. And in a prior life, I had been involved in policy and organizing, and I had this moment where I said, "No, this isn't right." We are in the middle of a crisis, and we do need to be treating people with compassion. And there is a lot of talk about this by policymakers and folks in the media, But if we're to be treated equally, then folks in recovery need to, stand up and say something about this. We need to say that we deserve better. If we are going to, be able to come to an end to this crisis, if we're going to be able to get people help, then folks in recovery need to stand up and they need to stick up for their own. And that's what we did, and it started very humble beginnings. We started Mobilize Recovery with $20, and we saw there was a deep desire for building a community of consequence, I guess you could say, within the recovery movement, to force forward thinking, I think, unifying change, right? And I think we've seen the fruits of that labor over the last many years. We've worked on hundreds of pieces of legislation in state houses around the country. We've worked on a ton of federal legislation. We've seen, folks see Narcan over the counter, right? Is a perfect example.
Right.
Like, this is great. Narcan's over the counter. I don't think people realize how much blood literally was spilled until we could get that done. We started calling for the FDA to approve Narcan OTC over the counter in 2019. And had been advocating policymakers in the White House and members of Congress and the FDA to approve it, and also working with the manufacturers, to join us in this cause. So all of these little subtle changes that people are seeing, they don't just happen on their own.
No, they don't. No, they don't. But, before you were an advocate, before you were an author, before you were working with President Clinton, I think you hit bottom in Los Angeles, didn't you?
I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that journey? Because, people want to, you're one of the biggest miracles I know. Can you tell us how you got there?
To back up a little bit, even before Los Angeles, I did have this up and coming career and trajectory of public policy and working in government. I was always fascinated by it. I was a overachiever, I guess you could say, in high school, and then going into college. Had worked for, several different policymakers, both Republican and Democrat. And when it came time to go to school for college, I chose Washington, D.C., went to school in D.C. for 2 years. And while I was there, ended up landing a position at the White House where I worked at the tail end of the Clinton administration, and stayed in D.C. after leaving the White House, and was working on several different public policy initiatives up there. And in 2003, went on a hiking trip and ended up falling and splitting my patella, which is your knee, and injuring and cracking my ankle, and ended up in the care of an urgent care physician in Maryland. And that's where they prescribed me hydromorphone for the first time, Dilaudid. And I was told I would need to get that knee checked out. But in the meantime, here's a prescription to help with the pain. And they wrapped up the knee, and I was supposed to get an MRI, and I never got the MRI. But I did keep going back to that prescriber, and they kept giving me another prescription. I also, at the time, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, was dealing with a lot of internal traumas. I was closeted at that time, struggling with identity issues. I'm a survivor of adverse childhood experiences, including sexual abuse. And so there was a lot of stuff to unpack there. And it felt that, the hydromorphone was, not just curing some, physical ailments, but also emotional ailments for me that I had been dealing with and packing for quite some time. And the nexus of this story was my father had recently passed away, and I'm born and raised in Miami, Florida, and my mom lived down in Broward County, Florida, and she said I had to come home, and be closer to home. And so I left DC and came down to Florida, and I was still on this hydromorphone. And I remember going into my primary care doctor as soon as I got to Florida and said, hey, I am on this medication. And I wouldn't classify myself as a quote unquote addict, when I got to Florida. I think I was getting dependent, but I still had a job. I was still performing well. I still had insurance, still had an apartment, all those things was still on the up and up. But the doctor said to me, hey, Ryan, I don't do that type of medicine. You're going to need to see a specialist for this. I said, okay, great. And he said, there's plenty to choose from. Well, I ended up with a specialist, but it ended up being a pill mill, a pain clinic. Oof. And if you know anything kind of about, your listeners know anything about the modern day overdose opioid crisis we're in, the pill mills were a real thing, and particularly in South Florida. Like that's where,
yes, they were.
That was ground zero for it. And I remember they called the I-95 the Oxycontin Express, right? Because folks would be coming down from Kentucky and Appalachia down to South Florida, getting pills going up, all things I didn't know at the time, but when I went to that doctor, they said, hey, you're on this medication. You've got to take, every 4 hours, we have a new medication formulation that's out. You take it, twice a day, every 12 hours. Risk of addiction is less than 1%. It's doing phenomenal things for folks, and you should try it. And that was Oxycontin. And to make a long story very short, my journey into full-blown substance use disorder was not protracted. It was within, 2 years that I was kicked out of my apartment, evicted. It was, within 2.5 years, I had my first bout with treatment. I lost any ability to work, and had my first overdose, I think, within 5 years. I was abruptly cut off from the medication in 2018 when Florida decided they were going to fix the pill mill crisis by just shutting down the pill mills and cutting everybody off from the pills. But as we know, that kicked into the second wave of the overdose crisis, the first wave being, the prescribed medications, the second wave being heroin. And I remember the day I was kicked off. I remember the doctor telling me, who knew at that point that I did have a problem, but continued to prescribe, telling me that I would no longer be receiving this medication. And I remember being like, what do you mean? Like, what do I do? I was in full-blown withdrawal. And I left that doctor's office and remember somebody offering me heroin at a much cheaper cost. And it was really a downward spiral from there. Many attempts at treatment, and I tried to make a geographic change. I had a little bit of sober time under my belt in 2012. I went to a public treatment center, and I was out like 8 months, in AA, going to meetings. And I said, you know what, this is for the birds. I remember saying, I need something different in my life. I need to get out of this hole that I'm here in Florida. And I went out to California, and I was out in Southern California, in Los Angeles, I think for less than 3 months before I had a relapse. And that relapse led me right to the streets. I mean, I was on the in the tents, in and out of the tents.
Wow.
I never was arrested or anything like that. I was a pretty boring drug addict, I had a problem, and it for the weeks, about a month leading up to the day I got help. I had a corner on Hollywood and Vine, that's where I was.
Wow.
I had a conversation. I would talk to my mom regularly through collect calls on a payphone, because they still had those back in 2013 and 2014 in Los Angeles. I remember a conversation with my mom actually right around this time, 10 years ago. It was going into October, I remember. And she said, I don't have anything I can give you to help you. But you need to get help. She said, there's no money. There's no insurance. There's nothing. Like, and my mom had gone through, for many years, a long period of time where, loans were taken out and, her condo was mortgaged and credit card debt and all this.
Wow.
To try and get me help. And we were really at our tail end. And she said, but the one thing I will do for you is I will find you places that you can call. I will sit here on the internet and I will call with you to see if we could find you a place. And she found me a public treatment facility in Tarzana. And she said, you need to call this place. And I remember calling from that payphone, walking to that payphone every morning at 8 a.m. I was told I needed to make that call to see if there was a bed available. And on Thanksgiving Eve, 2014, the voice on the other end said yes. And I jumped a cab because I had no money and got up there and checked into treatment. And it was the first time that I was offered buprenorphine for my use disorder. And they kept me on buprenorphine for a minute and then transferred me. I ended up transferring to another treatment center that I stayed longer, and then went into a recovery house. And I stayed in recovery housing for 18 months. I didn't want to leave. I got I got a very, nice invitation of, hey, like maybe it's time that you think about, going out and trying this thing on your own now because you're doing pretty well. But I will tell you that there was a moment, when I talk about that moment of change that I had in 2016, after losing my friend Greg and my friend Nick and my friend Tyler and so many others, that I did get more public about my recovery and I did start writing and I did start the nonprofit. And again, this is just my story. It's not, my story is unique, although we have common threads, I think, between all of our story. Mine's very unique to me. I felt a sense of accountability when I got public. I felt a sense of, as soon as I let the cat out of the bag per se, and everybody knew, that I was in recovery and I started wearing my struggles on my sleeve, but also my hopes and my dreams, right? At the same time, there was a level of accountability that I had to myself and also to my community. And it has been a benefit in my recovery, but I have, it's also very important. I think you can probably relate to this. The more public that you get about your recovery, the more you do things like podcasts and, be a social entrepreneur in the space or write books or nonprofits or whatever it is, that you stay really close to your own personal recovery program and you keep it very separate.
I'm sure on your tours, on the books, all the people that you meet, you get flooded with calls from partners, from parents. My husband, my son is still struggling with fentanyl. What do you tell them?
Listen, I think it's important. I mean, first and foremost, to just set the table on fentanyl, right? Like do that. Yeah. I mean, this is now the third wave of the crisis and arguably probably the deadliest wave of the crisis that we've seen right now. And, we've transitioned from this agricultural crop-based drugs, right, to this drug supply that's completely synthetic. And I think it has serious consequences, for law enforcement and public health. And, I think we really do need to look at how we approach our drug enforcement strategies and public health strategies in the United States. In the synthetic era, whatever package of, meth or fentanyl that gets seized, can easily be replenished and replaced. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl and synthetic, stimulants and psychostimulants like meth, they're just dominating the market because they're so easy and they're cheap, to make. Drug traffickers, they no longer need acres of land, right? They no longer need arms that are going to protect the land. They no longer need to wait for these long harvesting seasons. They no longer need to pay farmers. All they need is just this steady supply of chemicals, which they have in spades and a cook with, basic chemistry skills tucked away in some remote location. So, that's enough to produce tons and tons of synthetic drugs. It's completely different from the way it used to be. So with fentanyl, I think there's, some important nuances around it. Addiction is a progressive disease. We know that. There are kids who are experimenting with drug use right now, who are getting fake prescription pills with fentanyl in it, and it is killing them. And it is tragic, right? But then there's another class of people who are intentionally using fentanyl, right? I mean, fentanyl is cheap on the street. In San Francisco, you can get a gram for like $6 right now. That's the going rate, right? It's incredibly cheap and it's potent. And as people, graduate towards levels of tolerance, they're now searching out, active drug users are searching out fentanyl, because withdrawal from fentanyl is substantially more than it is from heroin and other prescription opioids. With a family member, if you have a family member, a friend, a loved one, romantic partner that is struggling with fentanyl, it is incredibly important. There's what you should do, and then there's actually the practicality of what's happening in this situation and how, you handle it. I think there's two goals, right? The goal A is you've got to keep that person alive, right? We have to keep the person alive. And equally as important, we've got to get them help and treatment. And so there's two strategies, I think, that go hand in hand. And I dealt with this just last week with a friend of mine who's struggling. I want nothing more than for them to see the light at the end of the tunnel, that there is hope, and that if we can just get them on medication and get them into, even if they're averse to inpatient treatment, getting them some outpatient treatment, getting them into a buprenorphine program or even a methadone program, like that's the goal as like a starting point, right? Because at least we can start to reclaim some of those parts of the brain that are being hijacked right now so that better decisions can be made and we can get people on a journey of wellness. But some people don't want that, right? That's not what they want. And that's not their goal right now. And sadly, that is the case with a lot of folks. And in that case, we need to be compassionate and we need to encourage people, to have naloxone, not use alone, test their drugs, right? Not using alone is a big factor. Like if somebody is in having that hard discussion, with your kid or your loved one, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because we know what's possible. I was them. That's one of the most frustrating parts is I was that person. And I missed that, in 2014, that Thanksgiving Eve, 2014, the people I was using with at that time are dead today because of fentanyl.
Right on.
I missed fentanyl by this much. It crashed onto the Southern California scene within 6 months of me getting sober. Just boom. There was a fentanyl explosion that started taking off. It started on the East Coast and came to the West. So I think there are, strategies, but they have to be person-centered, right? It's like that, not one fits all for every person. And I think when people have the ability to bring a medical professional into this decision-making process, do it, right? These are decisions that you should be involving, a trusted doctor, addictionologist, to be able, or addiction certified doctor to assist with. But, one of the reasons I wrote Fentanyl Nation, and I'm excited to get it out into the world, is that this shouldn't be an issue that's consumed by today's, brand of toxic politics, which is what is happening right now. We are seeing fentanyl and solutions to fentanyl being politicized by extremists on both sides, right? Like we're seeing the inability to actually come together in the interest of public health and saving lives. Addiction and solving the overdose crisis used to be quite a bipartisan unifying issue, folks. I think everybody was tripping over themselves, certainly during the 2016 presidential campaign, and even in 2020, talking about how we can't simply arrest our way out of this. Law enforcement has an important role to play in this, but we can't put the entire burden of solving this crisis on law enforcement, right? That's just insane in my opinion. And it's never been a recipe for success here. That is a strategy, while they have their place and we need to keep our communities safe, we have to be looking at this through a supply and demand, issue. Yes, we need to reduce supply, but reduction of supply also is not a sustainable strategy unless we're also reducing demand. How do we reduce demand, right? So lots of strategies there. We need to be building a robust behavioral health infrastructure. It is insane to me that in 2024 that people can't get on-demand treatment when they need it. It is insane to me that we don't have a robust, trained peer workforce that can meet demand for folks who need help. I am a big believer in peers. I think peers are the next recovery. Peers are the next frontier in the recovery movement. Building a stable infrastructure of qualified recovery homes. Making sure, it's also not just about treatment, right? Like I said, there's several steps. Goal needs to be to keep people alive. Goal needs to be to get people treatment. But then the goal needs to be that folks maintain that pathway, right? And what do they do to be set up for success, right? That means we need to get folks trained for jobs. We need to make sure that there's workforce training and job opportunities for folks. We need to make sure that they're in safe, stable, secure houses, recovery homes. We don't treat cancer or any other illness of the body or mind by just giving one treatment and then never checking up with somebody ever again. We need to be treating this as a chronic disease, is defined, and not just in its acute phase where we give someone treatment for, 30 days or 60 days or 90 days if they're lucky. These days with insurance companies, folks are lucky to get a week of paid treatment, right? We need to hold insurance companies accountable for violating mental health and addiction parity. I find insurance companies as culpable in this crisis as big pharmaceutical companies were in the early 2000s, right? Insurance companies deny care every single day under arbitrary rules that are prohibited by federal law, yet no state or federal authority holds them accountable for it. So there's a lot to do. And the thing is these aren't things that are new, right? Like we know what we need to do. It's just getting out of our own way and getting the political willpower to make it happen in our communities. And I think one of the biggest barriers that we have to that is this divisive tone that's going on right now in our political system, where fentanyl and people who are struggling, become pawns for votes, if that makes sense. I know that's
oh wow, yeah, it's real though.
It's real. It is real.
It's very real.
Let's talk about just briefly. Look, and I have my own politics, but I'll call people out when they need to be called out. The disastrous presidential debate that happened in June, that changed the trajectory of the entire presidential race overnight between Biden and Trump. Jake Tapper asked a very, I think, pointed question, and I was so grateful he did it. And I sent Jake a message, and I thanked him for the question. I said, even though you didn't get an answer. And he said his question to both Biden and Trump was, there are millions of Americans struggling with addiction right now. What will either of you or both of you do to help get people the treatment and help that they need, who are struggling of addiction, and help solve this overdose crisis? You could hear a pin drop. And then I think both of them in their own way made mention of fentanyl dogs and fentanyl machines. And I was sitting there like, what world am I living in? We are going backwards. Here we are in 2024. We were getting better educated answers on that 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And here we are in 2024 with all the advancements that are on the table, with one of the largest public health catastrophes we have had in a generation, aside from COVID in the United States. And neither presidential candidate has a reasonable answer to how we're going to fix this. That is a problem. That is a problem.
That's a big problem.
Yet TV commercials and, the politics of the day, you'll hear fentanyl, fentanyl, fentanyl. I want to know how people are going to solve it, right? And you can't just solve it on one lopsided answer, which is on the supply side. I will emphasize the supply side is important, but reducing supply on its own will not solve the problem, because if you don't deal with demand on the public health side, maybe we get rid of fentanyl, eradicate fentanyl, but we are in the synthetic era where something will take its place. We know it.
I want to highlight something that I think is super duper important. I've been sober 37 years. I've been in private practice over. Thank you, brother. I've been in private practice probably 26 years now. Never in my wildest imagination would I would say to somebody, listen, test the drugs when you go out tonight.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the last couple, because I'm like you, I'm a huge fan in harm reduction. I'm a huge fan. We got to keep you alive. So like, there's designated drivers. There's designated somebody who carries Narcan, who carries things and that's just the way it is. And I have no problem giving that message. And I want to give it to right now. And I really applaud you for doing that, because we got to keep people alive until hopefully the light hits them.
That's right. And then it's our goal to be that light for them until they find their own light,
Right on.
And that's why I'm also a big believer in lived experience and peers. I believe that it takes an all approach, right? We need clinicians, we need medicine, but that alone isn't the answer. It's all and, and oftentimes I do, one of the things that I do write about in the book is I do get a little frustrated at how, peers are sometimes discounted in their value in this work. I think recovery peers offer a lot of hope to people that clinicians can't. And I think it's both. I think both of those married together make for a good solution. And back on your point around drug checking and testing, so important. It's so important. And it's not just for people with substance use disorder, right? I mean, I live in Las Vegas, and I was having this conversation with a few police officers the other day, and they were asking about like, what's the point of checking drugs if, someone's an addict, and they were being very genuine about it, and they're going to use anyway. And I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. They may use anyway, or maybe searching for fentanyl. And my advice to them is make sure they're not using alone and there is naloxone at hand. But drug checking is really important, probably for like a quarter of the visitors that we have staying in our resorts right now, who are getting cocaine and other substances and using them, who are not, folks who qualify as having a substance use disorder. Maybe they're recreational users. Maybe they haven't used drugs in 3 years, but they're in Vegas and they're going to use drugs, and
right.
Like we need to make sure that they have adequate supply of drug checking, technology and strips, because those are folks who are really susceptible to an overdose and death resulting from overdose. If there is fentanyl in their drugs, and likelihood is there probably will be.
Let's talk about Fentanyl Nation. You've written a couple books. What inspired this? What do you want the message to be? Let's talk about that, because it's really special book, and congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when I finished my second book, Unsettled, which was about my role in the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy and a lot about the Sacklers, that came out in 2021. And that was just a heartbreaking experience that I'd been involved in for over 3 years at that point. And I thought that was the last book. I was going to be done. And I was inspired to write Fentanyl Nation. I had lost another friend. And I remember turning on the TV one night and seeing a town hall on fentanyl. and hearing what was being proposed, as solutions, and really some of the rhetoric that was coming out and a lot of fear around the drug. And it just wasn't matching up to what I was seeing on the ground. It wasn't matching up to the reality of the stories that I was hearing every day. It wasn't matching up to what I know, from this work, and what and what so many of us know who do this every day, was a way out. And then I just it felt like starting in 2022 or so, the fentanyl narrative just exploded. And you started hearing all of these stories of what was going on in communities. And some of the stories, were fact-based and heartbreaking, and I could empathize and felt it in my heart. And then some of them were just pure fiction, and they weren't being corrected. And while that makes for good clickbait, right? And it makes for, it makes for viewership, it had real world consequences to it. There was a level of fear that had been instilled around some of the misinformation being put out there, where I came across a situation where someone was afraid to, had called me, and someone had overdosed, and they were afraid to resuscitate somebody with rescue breathing because they didn't want to have a fentanyl exposure and die. And I was like, that's not going to happen to you. I promise you. And we while we're waiting for 911, you need to be, administering rescue breathing if you can. You are not going to overdose from doing that. And I had this kind of clarion wake up that we needed to do something. And I decided to write the book. And I'll forever be profoundly grateful to the experts and the family members and the boots on the ground folks who spent time with me and trusted me with their stories, because I really tried to write it. A lot of ink's been spilled about this. A lot of, there's been a few books about it written before, but I wanted this to be a different book. I to be a book that necessarily instilled, the fear of God in people. I wanted to really set the record straight, but also to bring people down to the ground floor, to see through other folks' experiences what was actually happening, but also wanted to offer a prescriptive way out that I think is widely accepted. And if we could just get out of our own way with the politics piece of it, we could save more lives. And it was really a call to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We've been through this before. We were through this with crack cocaine. I write it at length about the crack epidemic of the 80s and the 90s, and how many of the same techniques, honestly, and strategies that we hear about today are old tropes of the past, and we've got to be careful of that.
How do you stay patient, persistent, when you get people lying to you in public policy? You get closed doors a lot. You get a lot of people that just aren't interested. How do you stay focused? How do you keep marching? Can you tell me a little bit about your process?
So it might be a little corny, but you'll probably you may relate to.
I love corny. Corny works.
Well, I mean, it's corny to some. I have a pretty good meditation and prayer process every morning. It's been quite consistent, and I ask for patience. I ask for calm. I ask for acceptance. And I think the longer that I've been doing this, and the more I've been doing this, I've also realized that when you hit bumps in the road, right, there's always another day, and
right on.
And typically that next day takes you on a different journey, that nets a even more positive outcome than what you were hoping for before. As long as you are, I think the most important thing is, as long as you're always authentic about the direction that you want to head in, as long as your top of mind focus is of being of service to others and not to yourself. And by lifting others up, you're also lifting yourself up, right? For me, it's always, how do you lift more people up? And in the process, you get lifted as well, because if you're lifting yourself up first, and this is in terms of the advocacy, it usually goes in the wrong, it goes sideways. That's when the ego comes in and all that. And we all have ego, but the more you do this work, it's also important to maintain a sense of humility and to be humble and to be kind and to never forget why you're doing it. I always ask for guidance in the morning in my meditations around, if, somebody needs help, please deliver me to them to help them.
Right on.
That's where I want to be. And it happened. I mean, yesterday is a perfect example. My life is insane right now, right? Like, I've got the book release on Tuesday, our national bus tour starting on Friday. I'm on the ballot here in Nevada. I'm running for the Nevada State House. So, election day is coming up, and there's
wow,
State Assembly, and there's just a lot going on. And I got negative TV commercials running about me. And it's just my dog's running around, it's like 9:30 in the morning yesterday, and 50,000 emails I need to reply to. And I got a text from a guy who I haven't talked to in 20 years, a friend of mine who saw something on social media. I'm friends with him on Facebook, and he sent me a text because my number has been the same for a while. And he was like, "Hey, Ryan, do you have a second? I need to talk to you about my brother, and he's struggling." And I'm thinking to myself, for 2 seconds, I'm like, "Oh my God, I don't have time today." I know what that rabbit hole entails, because it happens all the time. There's you know what I mean? It's a lot.
It's not a 2-minute conversation.
Not a 2-minute conversation. And usually there's a lot of follow-up work attached to it. And I took a deep breath and I pulled myself away from the laptop and I said, "No, this is actually what you need to do right now. This is everything else can wait. Everything else is is being driven from up here, and what's happening, on here right now is being directed to here. And that's where your focus needs to go." And that's what I did. And it was probably maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours of my day. And I walked away from it and I was and then I had this profound sense of gratitude that with everything that's going on in my life right now, and all the worries in the world that I have right now, just how grateful I am for the journey and where I'm at. And it's taking it one day at a time. And thank God, let me tell you, the other secret sauce to this is find yourself a group of fellows in recovery that couldn't give a shit about any of the books or the bus tours or the nonprofits and just call you on your shit every single day. And I have I have friends that I have recovery fellows that I got sober with, who I talk to every day, check in with me with, gratitude texts in the morning, have never even read my books and never will. You know what I mean? And
I love it, man.
It's the greatest thing. Won't listen to this podcast. Don't care. You know what I mean?
Right on.
It's the greatest thing. And it has kept me, centered.
Right on. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to acknowledge what your life's now. You got an incredible partner. You're madly in love. I think I saw you got a dog that plays the piano.
Yeah. That's not my dog. That was another dog. But yeah, that was another dog. Yeah.
I was like, well, tell us about your fella, how long you've been married, and congratulations on that.
Gosh. We married.
That's awesome.
We married in 2 years ago at the peak of Mount Charleston here in Las Vegas. Sean and I met in 2018. He was working for a recovery nonprofit he's from the Midwest in Minneapolis, and then had moved out here to Las Vegas in late 2018. And he just completes me. It's a greatest thing the world's ever happened to me, aside from getting sober.
Beautiful.
Those are the two greatest things that have happened. Have been getting into finding recovery, which is my life, and falling in love and being madly in love every single day. And he also has to deal with a lot of this too. And so he's a really good partner and very supportive of everything. And it's interesting too, because we're both in recovery, right? So we have our own boundaries even within our house around recovery. which has been a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse, but it's been a blessing, because it's like, we know, we know when to kind of give each other space. You know what I mean? Like, we can relate to each other when we're kind of going through something, and it's been nice to have those principles under our roof.
Beautiful. Oh, I love that, man. Love that. And so, final thoughts first off, thank you for paying a 12-step call on me. Thank you for paying a 12-step call on our listeners here. Final message. What do you want to say to everybody? How do you want to close it up?
Never give up. Never give up. One day at a time.
Right.
There's so many times when in use, in early recovery, in advocacy, when you just want to throw in the towel, and don't give up. There's always, don't give up, and always ask for help. That's the other thing too.
Right on.
Like, always ask for help.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. All right. Well, buddy, Godspeed. God bless. Thank you. Have a great day. And maybe I'll see you on Friday in Los Angeles.
Yeah,
huh? Are you going to be out here for the thing?
Yeah.
I'll be there too. Be expecting
good,
a big
brother.
Seano hug. Okay. All right. Thank you, man.
You got it.
Bye, buddy.
The Seano Show is a production of iHeart Podcasts, hosted by me, Seano McFarland, produced by Pod People and 28th Ave. Our lead producer is Keith Cornelek. Our executive producer is Lindsay Hoffman. Marketing lead is Ashley Weaver. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.